An exponentially increasing system is unsustainable by definition. The current fiat system as it exists, the debt is linked to the money. You cannot price out the entire middle class from a good life and expect the system to survive. It's just not possible. There is no completely perfect system, but Bitcoin is the best shot we have at a sound money system. Let's say there's a grid down scenario. You don't have electricity in your home anymore. In order for the Bitcoin network to go down, it's actually a lot harder than most people realize. There's nodes in the Siberian tundra in Russia. There's nodes in space. And there are also nodes stored in Faraday cages. The only realistic way in which the Bitcoin network could actually go down would be something like a worldwide EMP. If there's a global solar flare or if there's a nuclear war, my concerns are going to be bigger than my Bitcoin holdings. The money supply is going to continue to increase exponentially. The debt supply is going to go up exponentially. And that means inflation is going to get worse and worse and worse until people refuse to use it as money. If you don't own a hedge, if you don't own something to defend yourself against the inflation, you're going to be destroyed in real terms. Both gold and Bitcoin, I think, will play roles in that post-collapse scenario in rebuilding society.
World War III is already happening.
This is a house of cards, and it is in the process of collapsing right now.
You're going to see an economic crash, the likes of which we've never seen.
Hi folks, Canadian Prepper here. Today on the channel, we're joined by Roberto Rios, who goes by the moniker Peruvian Bull here on YouTube and X. He's a macro analyst and market commentator and outspoken Bitcoin advocate. Now, as a Bitcoin skeptic, who's somebody who's dabbled in Bitcoin probably since 2016, I've done a swing trade here and there. I've been meaning to get somebody on the channel who could try to convince me that it's a good idea. As you know, we've had many hard asset enthusiasts on the channel, from Lynette Zhang to, Peter Schiff and many others. Some of our guests, like Gerald Celente, have talked about, the potential benefits of having something like Bitcoin and gold. Now, as a prepper, obviously we're concerned about things that are tangible. So food, water, shelter, means of generating electricity, commodities, tools, tangible goods, things that have a dual purpose. So in the case of a monetary medium like silver or gold, there are actual intrinsic use cases for these things that are useful. One of those things is gold is used in the computer chips that a lot of Bitcoin is, as I jokingly say, printed on. What are your thoughts on crypto? And can you know how they say in The Wolf of Wall Street, can you sell me this pen? Can you sell my audience on Bitcoin today, Roberto?
Yeah, absolutely. So, actually, I've been following your channel for quite a while, and I'm a little bit of an amateur prepper myself. I have a go bag. We have a bunch of water and food at our house. We live near a well, so we're trying to move in that direction. But I totally understand where you're coming from, and that was actually my starting point as well. I started out as a gold bug, as someone who's just into reading Austrian economics, reading Mises, reading Rothbard, and my whole thesis up until about 2020 was gold is physical, gold is tangible. I can actually touch it. It's been proven as a monetary medium for thousands of years. It's a store of wealth, and it's an inflation hedge, right? And so this is what's going to succeed in the next monetary system. And so I dismissed Bitcoin just out of hand. And it wasn't until 2020 and 2021 when I really started doing more research on how Bitcoin works and the actual functionality of money that I started to understand the arguments for why Bitcoin, even in something like a post-transition world from the US as a world reserve currency or a post-fiat world, right? So the first refrain that people have is, look, this thing is digital, right? So let's say there's a grid down scenario. Let's say there's an energy blackout throughout the United States, and you don't have electricity in your home anymore. What is this thing worth? Well, the first refrain to that is, so in order for the Bitcoin network to go down, it's actually a lot harder than most people realize. The Bitcoin network is not exactly like the internet or any other network you've ever been familiarized with. Every other network usually uses centralized nodes, meaning all the cell towers, all the server farms. If you shut those down, like 20 or 30 locations within, let's say, even a single state, the entire network is down for the whole state. the Bitcoin network uses a decentralized system of nodes and miners, which is distributed globally. And so that means that as long as you have access to a rudimentary internet connection. When I mean rudimentary, I mean really rudimentary. You just need like a couple megabits a second of connection. You can even get connection for the Bitcoin network in the Sahara. Then you have access to all the information that's being broadcast by the nodes. So basically you can see what's happening with the network and you can make transactions. And that means that the only realistic way in which the Bitcoin network could actually go down would be something like a worldwide EMP. So your local disaster scenario where, let's say, your grid is down in your state, or even say a region of the country like the Pacific Northwest where I live, that wouldn't bring down the Bitcoin network, even in your area, as long as you're able to get some sort of signal. And there's all these different ways with the nodes that you can try to boost your signal to get it even without a traditional Wi-Fi connection. So it would still be accessible. And there are, I should say as well, there are ways that they're developing to allow transaction to happen off the chain, meaning like you don't even need an internet connection. Two phones will store the data, and then once you reconnect to the internet or reconnect to the Bitcoin network, it would all work. But so
just for clarification, then you only need one of these nodes that contains the entirety of the ledger for it to remain functional if things come back online.
Exactly. And we have nodes. There's nodes in the Siberian tundra in Russia. There's nodes in space. Blockstream is running about a dozen satellites with nodes. There's nodes basically all over the world. So to stop the record of transactions that is the Bitcoin network, you would have to simultaneously shut down every node. And there are also nodes stored in Faraday cages. So that means, let's say there's a world-ending, EMP event where there's a solar flare, all the grid is down, all electronics are fried. Well, we would have a record of the Bitcoin network. And so at least in theory, we could reboot it in the post-grid world. But of course, that would require us rebuilding the grid, and it would take years and years of reconstruction of our electrical and industrial systems. But in theory, we could I guess I don't know what you'd call it, reanimate, revive, right, the system. So really the only way the Bitcoin network goes down in a serious fashion is under an extreme scenario. In every other scenario, it would still work. And, I guess the second refrain that most people would have is, well, how can I use this for transactions? And my, I guess, pushback on that would be, well, first of all, there's the Lightning Network, which allows you to transact small amounts of Bitcoin. But second of all, gold and silver, they are forms of money, obviously, but I would hypothesize that in a grid down scenario, gold and silver would be more worth, they're worth money once you restart society and once everything kind of goes back to normal. In the interim period of, like, let's say 12 months where it's just chaos, what actually matters is food and bullets, not gold or silver or even Bitcoin, really. Like, what matters is you surviving and trying to just allow your family to make it to whatever, emerges out of the chaos.
Yeah, I would actually agree with that, because in order for, any sort of medium of exchange to be transacted in a post-collapse environment, there has to be some marketplace norms that are established. For myself personally, I have a problem with the fact that it emerged right around the financial crisis. It kind of emerged in an environment which is quite questionable and suspect. You have companies like BlackRock who own a significant portion of it. 90% of all the Bitcoin in existence has been mined, which means there's only 10% left to be had by the remainder of the population. And I presume that 99% of people don't own any Bitcoin. So what would you say about the possibility then of this being used as a mechanism to further concentrate wealth and power in the hands of very few amounts of people?
That's a really good criticism. And, that was one of my initial, I guess, sticking points with the entire thesis and ideology behind Bitcoin. But what I would say is, first of all, you're right. Bitcoin emerged in the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis, right? The white paper was published like August or October 31st, 2008. And the first nodes and first broadcast of the network was in January of 2009. And the entire, genesis of the Bitcoin network was kind of a you could call it like a cypherpunk outlay of the Occupy Wall Street movement. It was anger against the system. Our current fiat financial system is broken. I think everyone knows that. There's, infinite money printing by the Fed. There's infinite debt borrowing by the Treasury. We're seeing huge debt loads and interest expense right now being undertaken by the U.S. government. And this most recent bill obviously just accelerates that. And so we've seen the infinite bailouts. We've seen the absolute destruction of of Main Street wealth that has gone on. And a lot of people said, well, this Bitcoin thing is just like an idealistic idea of what the next financial system should be, but it's not practical. And I would say that's actually incorrect. So first of all, Bitcoin functions on something called a proof of work system. So this system is completely different than any other type of financial system we've had before. If you look at Ethereum, if you look at Cardano, if you look at any of these other crypto coins, about 95% of them are what is called proof of stake. And in a proof of stake system, the way that you validate a transaction is basically there's like a giant vote on which transactions are valid, right? And whichever node has the most Ethereum or the most Cardano or whatever the coin is gets the most votes in the system. But what that means is that the wealthiest people already get to influence the future of the system, meaning they get the votes to say who can transact and who cannot. And so that is a reflection of the system that we already have in fiat. We already have a system where the people in power have the most voting power to maintain and sustain the current system. Bitcoin is different because Bitcoin works on something called proof of work, which means every computer has to essentially do a very hard guessing game in order to solve the problem that verifies the block. And there's no way around it. It does not matter how much Bitcoin anyone owns. It does not equate to control over the system, because they separated the ability to, let's say, create or mine Bitcoin, so the issuance schedule and the actual ownership of it. So if I own 1 million Bitcoin, I can't influence the system any more than if I own 10 Bitcoin. And this is the first time a financial system has properly done this in a decentralized, right, very, very robust way where it would be very hard for someone to break the system. And many we've seen government pushback on even on Bitcoin, and it's proven to be something called anti-fragile, which is a term coined by Nicholas Taleb, which basically refers to systems that get stronger with testing. So your immune system, right? Things like that the more you test it, the more you lift weights, the stronger your muscles get. When Bitcoin was banned in 2021 in China, they destroyed the mining industry. They started arresting people, and thousands of people left China, and obviously hundreds of millions of dollars of mining equipment left with them. And we saw the hash power, which is the total computation exerted every single day on the network, fall by like 45%. And a lot of people said the Bitcoin network is over. Look, here's the government coming after it. The Chinese Communist Party, they're very powerful. And they were right. The hash power reduced for a couple months. And within a couple months, by the end of that summer, so it was like, August, September of 2021, 3 months later, the hash power was recovering. And within like 4 or 5 months, it was already back to all-time highs. And so what that told me is that the network is it's like a hydra. Every time you clamp down on one area of it that's gotten a little bit centralized, it just scatters and decentralizes itself even more. And so BlackRock owning, they own like 4% or something with their ETFs. Michael Saylor owns about 4%. He owns, I think, they're over 600,000 Bitcoin now, so they own a good sizable portion. They can try to influence public miners, they can try to influence some nodes, but it's really much more difficult to change the network than most people realize. And I guess you could say like the vulnerability in Bitcoin was much, much greater back in the early days. So 2011, 2012, 2013, when Bitcoin was still nascent, when it was still small, when the number of nodes was a couple hundred and not 15,000 or 20,000 like it is today, it was much easier to change the network. And that's evidence in the block size wars. So in 2014, 2015, there were a bunch of proposals to change Bitcoin, right? So people inside Bitcoin said, look, Bitcoin can only handle 3 transactions a second. If we want this to be global money, that is way too slow. Visa does 60,000 transactions a second. There's no way this will work. And those were the large blockers. The small blockers said, no, we need to keep it small because we need to keep it compact enough that each node or individual retail people can run nodes on at their house, or they can run small mining rigs at their house. And if you make the transaction size for each block bigger, then that means that it's going to take way more storage, and then only rich people will be able to run nodes, and then that will centralize the network. We don't want to centralize it in the hands of the wealthy. And so they had a fight, right? And they had a proposal to change the size of the Bitcoin network. They had 80% of the nodes agreeing to try to change it. Wasn't enough. You need something like 95 or 98%. You need, I wouldn't even call it a super majority. You need a hyper majority to change it. So the large blockers lost. They spent millions of dollars and 3 years trying to change the Bitcoin network to large blocks, and they failed. And that showed the resilience of the Bitcoin network and staying true to the ethos of we're going to be like gold. We're not here to be the next Cardano, the next Ethereum. We're here to be gold, and gold means unchanging. And so that means we're not going to change the block size of the network. We're not going to change how the nodes operate. We're not going to change any of this. And anything we do would require 95% consensus. And obviously, since so few things in the real world reach 95% consensus, that means basically nothing ever changes in the Bitcoin network. And so it's defended a couple of these attacks already. And it exhibits these features, like I said, of a decentralized system where any individual, any single person has an incredibly strong time at cracking it. And one of my other arguments to I guess rebut and finalize what I'm saying here is, if the NSA could have broken this, or if the CIA could have broken this, they should have done it in 2011. They should have done it in 2012. And if they can't do it today, then why haven't they done it yet?
So what are your thoughts on the origin, though, of this thing? Do you think that this Satoshi Nakamoto character was a real guy, or was it a lot of people suspect that perhaps this was some creation by the agencies that you mentioned in order to perhaps deflect attention away from, the things that central banks are buying?
Yeah, so that's another, actually, I think, valid conspiracy theory, because, right, Satoshi Nakamoto in Japanese means central intelligence, and so it could either be.
I didn't know that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
So it could be. It could be a
not decentral intelligence, but central intelligence.
Yeah.
Not decentralized intelligence.
No.
You think they would have, gone a little step further to?
No, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Look, it's whoever. So Satoshi Nakamoto, right? He was posting in cypherpunk forums for years before this happened. Which again, if it makes sense, either if he's a cypherpunk and a libertarian, or if he's a working for an intelligence agency, either could be plausible.
And he does have 1 million Bitcoin, correct? Or he does
have 1 million Bitcoin. Yeah, he has a huge amount, but it hasn't moved in about 12 years. It hasn't moved since 2013 or something like that. And people even theorize that he's dead, right? Because so his last few transmissions on this forum was basically he was handing over the keys, basically letting Hal Finney run the network, because he was stepping back and saying that he was going to go work on other projects.
Who's Hal Finney? What is that?
Hal Finney is one of the, I would say, core Bitcoin developers in the early days, and he was running some of the first nodes and miners in 2010, 2011 timeframe. Yeah, and so he also passed away.
Does BlackRock, or do some of these companies, do they do their own mining?
There are, so I don't know if BlackRock does mining. I do know that BlackRock has invested in publicly traded miners. Again, remember, when you own a miner, what you're really owning is a future income stream of Bitcoin. It doesn't relate to control or power over the network, because even if the miners have a proposal, it's the nodes who verify transactions. So just like how the US government has a system of checks and balances, the network itself has a system of checks and balances. So the miners might want to up the fees, but they can't, because the nodes will disagree with them, because the nodes don't want to make the network more expensive, because then no one will use it. So BlackRock, I don't know if they directly own miners, but I do know that they invest in them. There's a lot of public companies that invest in miners. But you're right, this whole origin, it it came out of the depth of the 2008 financial crisis and this, like, I guess, populist blowback against the establishment, right? At one of the founding paragraphs in the Bitcoin white paper was basically describing that the fiat financial system is broken and that the money was based on trust and that the central bankers had betrayed our trust. And so that's why we need what Satoshi called the trustless alternative, right? Something where you don't have a centralized counterparty, where if I'm going to send Canadian Prepper some money, I don't need to trust JP Morgan. I don't need to trust HSBC. I can just trust the network. I can not even trust the network. I just send it out to the network and people bid on it. People try to compete for my transaction. The miners work and expend energy because they want the reward. And because of this decentralized system, there's no single entity that I have to trust to get my message across. And that made the whole, I guess, ethos and culture of the Bitcoin community very libertarian in the early days, and it still retained its libertarian bent. And as to its, actual, I guess, like you said, control of from the CIA, the way it's designed, like I said, is no single entity could even control it if they wanted to. So if the CIA did invent this, then they don't necessarily have direct control over it today, especially at the size that it is today. Like I said, there's nodes in space, there's nodes in the Arctic, there's nodes all over South America, Africa.
This is all great stuff, but they do obviously now have a record, this ledger of every transaction that has been made, which, for somebody who wanted to kind of control a society, that would be something that would be very useful for them, one would suspect. The ability to track every single transaction going back to the beginning of the creation, the inception of the currency.
Yeah, absolutely. So you're right. Bitcoin is not, we call it, it's not anonymous, it's pseudonymous. So each address, you can track all the transactions. That's the nature of a decentralized ledger. All the transactions of everyone is broadcast to everybody else. But what the identifier that links me to that address is, the address is just a string of numbers and characters. So it's OXAB424. And then yours would be A27354. And so there's no direct way to know which person is correlated with which address. Now, that they've been trying to change that with the KYC laws. They've been doing, initiatives with the exchanges to make them register a KYC. So if you buy Bitcoin on an exchange, they absolutely do know you own that address, and they absolutely can track your Bitcoin, which is why tools like CoinJoins or mixers are so important, because you can go and take your Bitcoin and you can put it in this, basically like a tumbler. It washes all your coins with everyone else's coins, and then it pops it out at a new address. And then they can't track who owns which, and then they don't know, which address is yours. And so that breaks the chain of following it. But you are right. It is a trackable system, especially if you use the exchanges or the banks or any other, traditional financial medium to on-ramp yourself into Bitcoin. And that's a danger, right? I've long advocated for people to not use KYC solutions. And if people want to know about it, there's a couple of resources online that you can find to non-KYC your Bitcoin, because it is a big concern in the community.
Yeah, I was, I was first exposed to Bitcoin in 2008. And it kind of, I always get suspicious when something becomes popular for some reason. Like the Bitcoin algorithm could theoretically be replicated, and you could call it something else, right? Where unlike gold, there's a finite amount of this stuff. You can't just, claim that copper is gold one day, although a lot of people would like that. Unfortunately, you can't do that. Whereas you could theoretically just replicate the Bitcoin algorithm and popularize a new, version of Bitcoin, maybe something that is even more efficient. I still have an issue with the fact that when it emerged, it was immediately, it was viewed by the mainstream media as obviously they were talking about it, and you only get that if they want to kind of call attention to something. If there is a intention of popularizing and making it seem, if you want people to to do something, tell them they shouldn't do it. And it was kind of like they were promoting it in that sort of way. Couldn't Bitcoin just be replicated as something else? And why should people believe that it's going to endure and it's always going to be sought after when it could be replaced by something better in the future?
That's a good question. And I'd say that there's already been several attempts to do that, right? So we already talked about the block size wars. In the wake of the block size wars, there were several other, because what happened with the block size wars is that the large blockers, the people who wanted more transactions on the network, but that would mean more centralization, they lost. But in order to claim a victory, they forked the chain. So they essentially did what you said. They created a copy of the Bitcoin algorithm. Then they changed a couple of the parameters. So they said, okay, we're going to allow the nodes are going to do double the transaction throughput as before. So the nodes, there'll be fewer nodes, but because they'll be way more expensive and way bigger, but we'll be able to support more transactions. And so they forked into their own coin. And then there were a couple other forks. So we have Bitcoin Satoshi's Vision. We have Bitcoin Cash. And there's also something called Bitcoin Gold, actually. And so there's three clones now of Bitcoin, and all three have basically collapsed to zero in relation to Bitcoin. So Bitcoin Cash is, I think, at like $400 a coin right now, and Bitcoin's at $100,000. And so that just shows you like the market for Bitcoin Classic, like the original Bitcoin, is much, much greater. And the reason why, again, is because in a decentralized system, there are trade-offs that you cannot get around. And so this is called the blockchain trilemma. So you have, imagine a triangle and imagine three corners. You have decentralization, you have security, and then you have transaction speed. And so if you choose two of them, you get rid of one of them. So if you choose decentralized and security, so you want a super secure system, it takes a long time to verify transactions and the nodes are distributed everywhere. So it's very, very hard to break. Then it'll be a slow system because that's the nature of how this system has to work. And if you want to be very fast, well, then you have to either give up decentralization or security. And most people will give up the decentralization. So I always tell people like the fastest systems in the world, like Visa, are very centralized, right? Mm-hmm. Visa has just like 2 or 3 server farms stored in locations in the US. And if you knock down those server farms, the entire Visa network will be gone. And so of course they're, highly guarded, they're secret, they have tons of security there. But if those things were knocked down, or if there's a grid down scenario, it would be done. You'd be fried, right? And so anyone that tries to shift the Bitcoin network will invariably end up losing one of those qualities. Like I said, so if you go for speed, you'll lose decentralization or security. If you go for, let's say you try to go for more security, well, then you have to give up more on speed or on decentralization, right? It's just how it works. And Bitcoin itself is already incredibly secure because it uses something called the SHA-256 algorithm, which is actually military-grade encryption. And so to break it, which SHA-256 so far has not been broken, knock on wood, it would require an insane amount of compute power and an insane amount of resources and money to try to destroy the system. And then even if it did, that fork that you talked about is like a negative, which you're right, people could try to create copies of it, and they have, but there's always trade-offs. You could fork it positively. So let's say Bitcoin was broken. Let's say they break the SHA-256 algorithm, which everyone's talking about with quantum. They say, well, with quantum computers, this really, really strong encryption will finally be broken. Okay, they break it. They could fork the chain and create a new encryption algorithm that's actually pro-quantum, that's made by a quantum computer, and then they could just run on that encryption. And so now you'd have quantum computers defending the chain as well as attacking it. So it would equalize, right, the security. And so things like that are more, I guess, in-depth and nuanced takes, but they illustrate like this intense resiliency, And Bitcoin also has something called the network effect, which I'm sure you're aware of. The stronger and stronger the network gets, the more and more reason people have to stay in it. That's the reason why the dollar has had a staying power for so long. The reason why Facebook is so big. If I went out tomorrow, I could copy the Facebook code base and I could try to make a Facebook clone. But how many people would use it? Not many, because why? Not many people are already there. So systems this complex have this inherent, I guess you call feedback loop, flywheel
Yeah.
effect that you need to get started in order to get going, if that makes sense.
That
And
is true. And
Bitcoin has already gotten started. So these other
yeah.
coins would be starting at ground zero.
I mean, that said, you still do have companies emerge in an environment where you have things like a Facebook, like you had Snapchat emerge and start to become popular. You had MySpace used to be, one of the biggest social media platforms. In my mind, if you were to do this transition to a decentralized fair currency, it would almost have to happen in mass, where everybody had kind of like an equal opportunity to convert their existing wealth into that digital currency. We're seeing the increasing concentration of wealth, and there is that Pareto principle where the more wealth you have, the more you make, right? So we're seeing that reach a breaking point in society, and that is now just being replicated in the Bitcoin network. And I would say almost to an extent which is even more extreme, because you have BlackRock owning 4% of the entire network, which some people are saying is going to replace money. Well, if that's true, then there's only 10% left for the rest of the planet.
Well, so I see your points. One thing, I'll try to parse apart your question into
Long-winded
multiple answers.
diatribe.
Yeah. So first off, you mentioned, okay, we could do a more advanced decentralized system where people just convert their current fiat holdings into the next money. And I would say, how is that not a continuation of our fiat system? Because in that scenario, all the wealthy people who are billionaires will own disproportionate amounts of the network. And Bitcoin was trying to initially solve this problem because the only way you could own Bitcoin was by mining it or by getting it sent to you. So the nature of the network is decentralized issuance. So I don't have control over a centralized node where I can issue Bitcoin and then send it to you because you're my friend or because I like you. I can't, control a centralized money printer like the Federal Reserve can and send money to the defense manufacturers and to, the healthcare companies and to insurance giants. Like I don't have that ability anymore because it's a decentrally issued system. And you're right, in any system, there will be wealth concentration. That's the nature of economics. Even though people don't like to admit it, the Pareto distribution is actually much more widely, I guess you could say, even distributed or widely seen throughout the universe. Really, even in the size of stars, the size of black holes, the height of trees in the Amazon rainforest. The fact these feedback loops will work in the real world to propel certain things higher and drag other things lower. And you could even say that's why gold was successful for so long. Gold had intrinsic properties that gave it an advantage. And once it had enough of an advantage over silver and copper, it just raced ahead. And no other currency was truly ever used really as a reserve currency except for gold. Silver was intermittently, but gold was the standard for centuries. And so when you look at Bitcoin, again, and you think about the future attacks, any future attack would have to compromise in some way. We already have a decentralized issue system. You're right. We do have new wealthy people in this system. A few of them are old players like BlackRock or State Street, but most of them are completely new people. There are individuals who own, like Michael Saylor, who owns a huge chunk of the network. There are tons and tons of, I guess you call them like retail investors who bought Bitcoin in 2010, and now they own 10,000 coins or 20,000 coins, which proportionally is much more than they would own in the current fiat system. And so, yes, there will still be wealth, but the wealth will be differently distributed. And the benefit of Bitcoin and the true selling point is that your ownership of the network does not equate to control. In the current system,
they could theoretically, though, if I'm a person who owns all this Bitcoin and I have billions of dollars, I could go and I'm in a better position to go and start mining Bitcoin in the nether regions of the Arctic or the Siberian tundra than somebody who doesn't, somebody who's just mining it on their, computer at night while they sleep. The more money you have, the easier it is for you to mine Bitcoin at scale.
mm-hmm. That's fair. That's fair. And I even heard the refrain, which is probably similar to your argument, is if you had to put a ton of Bitcoin, you could buy off a bunch of the nodes, right? You could try to buy off the miners, pay people to not verify these other people's transactions, or pay people to vote with you when there's a Bitcoin network proposal. And that's fair. You like, again, Bitcoin does not mean all corruption in the world is gone. It does not mean all wars will never happen again. It doesn't mean that. It just means it's much, much more difficult to do those things. And I guess the argument I would use to push back on that is, so let's say somebody got major, significant control over the network. Let's say BlackRock controls a bunch of the nodes. What are they going to realistically do to the network? If they try to inflate the supply, that lowers the value of Bitcoin, which they own. So they're a huge stakeholder in that. If they try to lower the security, that's their asset, the security of their asset that they're lowering. Anything that harms the network will actually be detrimental to them as well. And so the irony is, getting some of these large players in the game actually makes Bitcoin more secure, especially from something like a nation state attack, right? The U.S. government is much less likely to attack Bitcoin when BlackRock owns 4% and when Michael Saylor owns 400,000, 500,000 coins, because now they have wealthy people who have a vested interest in protecting it. And now this isn't the ethos of Bitcoin. The Bitcoin was never meant or desiring to move in this direction. It's just the way that the cards have been dealt. But we have to roll with the punches and how we take them. And like I said, because of the intrinsic nature of Bitcoin, the decentralized aspect, the basically like disinflationary or deflationary aspect of the money supply, I would much rather live in a system where a couple wealthy people do own 10% of the of the supply of Bitcoin, but nobody can print it and nobody can just change the rules arbitrarily, versus the current system where both of those are possible.
Okay, but I think one of the problems is if 90% of the Bitcoin has been mined and a very small fraction, I don't know how many people actually own Bitcoin, but I presume it's less than 1% of the human population. I could be wrong about maybe it's 2 or 3%. Maybe it's 0.001%. I don't know. You play that tape through. If you believe, like some of the Bitcoin enthusiasts claim, that there's going to be Bitcoin is going to be worth $1 million. That concentrates wealth to such an extent in the hands of a few people, which, we haven't even yet seen in the fiat system. So let's just play that tape through to Bitcoin is now worth $10 million or $1 million even, a coin. So that's 10x. What is Michael Saylor's stake worth right now?
I think it's 50 billion, something like that, 50, 60 billion. Yeah.
So
it's like 70% of the market cap of his company. So it's like, yeah, 60 billion.
Right. Which is kind of a weird sort of Ponzi thing in and of itself, that whole MicroStrategies thing. But okay, so we're talking about $500 billion potentially. And you're going to have all these people who are buying in at those levels, which will not have benefited from being these early adopters. They'll essentially be the bag holders. So if we were to all start off at the same place, you say that would be some replication of the fiat-based system. But if you have a situation whereby people are buying into this thing at these higher levels, benefiting the people who bought in earlier disproportionately, that seems to more so replicate the current system, which is like, I could see like the Bitcoin network almost seems like a far more extreme form of Pareto wealth concentration than even fiat was. That's why some people would put it on top of the fiat pyramid, or the monetary pyramid, which of course has gold at the bottom. If it was the case that maybe there was 90% of the Bitcoin left to mine, I might feel differently about that. But because there's so few coins left to mine and so much of it has been concentrated into the hands of a very small amount of people so far, regardless of whether or not they can manipulate that specific network, they could use that money to, control the world in other ways, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And okay, so
So
here's what I
Michael
would.
Saylor, if he's worth $500 billion, imagine how many politicians you can buy with $500 billion.
That's true, but none of those politicians can affect change in the Bitcoin network in any meaningful way.
But they can affect change in society in other ways.
That is true. That is true. Yeah, it like I said, it doesn't, some Bitcoin maximalists will tell you Bitcoin solves everything. They say, there won't be any more corruption, there won't be any more bad, like I've seen this in one of the books at Bitcoin Standard. They said that there won't be any more bad bosses, and I thought that that was ridiculous. I'm a libertarian, but there'll be absolutely bad bosses. There will be assholes. There will be wars. There will be bad things happening, drug trade, all these things happening in the world, even with a Bitcoin Standard. It just separates the benefit of the Bitcoin Standard. Just separates money from state. And what I would say to you is that you're right. So as it currently stands, about 90% has been mined. About 2.5 million coins are lost forever. So those are in hardware wallets, in defunct wallets that no longer have access to, and so those cannot be accessed. And so a large part of the Bitcoin is already owned. But the difference is not everyone in the network, and this is where the Bitcoiners get into internal arguments. Actually, a lot of people in the network aren't really in it for believing that the next monetary medium. They believe that it's just a number go up technology, right? They just say this is digital gold. When inflation comes, it's going to spike super hard, and I'm going to sell. And so right now, as you can see on the chart behind you, we're hovering at about $108,000, $110,000 a coin. And people have been saying, well, why isn't Bitcoin higher when inflation is pretty bad? The Fed is going to start easing, especially much harder later this year, and we're in this global debt crisis where the federal government is borrowing, trillions and trillions of dollars every year just to keep the lights on, and the deficits are growing every single year. Well, the reason why is because there's actually a lot of people selling right now at $100,000 a coin. So a lot of the OG Bitcoiners want to profit. They want to go consume. And once you have these people start to consume, and they either sell their Bitcoin and that drives down the price, which makes it more affordable for everybody, or they go spend their Bitcoin in some real way, right? Like let's say they go to Costa Rica, El Salvador, they can buy a house for Bitcoin in El Salvador. Then the Bitcoin now starts to circulate. Because you're right, as it currently stands, Bitcoin is progressing through the three forms of, money, or the three, I guess you could call it, like the three-factor model of money. Money has to be a store of value, has to be a medium of exchange, and then finally a unit of account. Now, those are just normally listed as three factors that money has to have, but it's also a roadmap for the timing of how to change something from non-money to money. So gold was the same way. Gold was first a store of value, and then it became a medium of exchange once they were able to purify it and standardize it. And then it became a unit of account, because now you could say, okay, these are official gold coins minted by the treasury. And this is like, it takes 3 gold coins to buy that ship. It takes 2 gold coins to buy that house. Okay, I understand now. It's a unit of account. I can do accounting with it. Bitcoin's still in the store of value. It's still really early in this money game. A lot of people will say that it's money. I'd say actually it's not right now. Bitcoin is really just a inflation hedge asset. Now it has the potential to become money in the future, but it's not really used as a monetary medium. And once it starts to overcome things like Gresham's law, once it starts to overcome things like the price stability that we need to see, basically like the Bitcoin price has to be frozen at, let's say, $1 million a coin for 5 years for people to actually start considering to use it as money. Once we see those things start to happen and the volatility dies down and the chaos dies down and it's just stable, then we can start to see it used as money. And once it starts to be used as money, then people can earn it rather than buy it just by working. So people with Bitcoin will go out and spend it.
Okay, these are all great arguments, and honestly, this is an excellent conversation, I must say, so far. You really know your stuff. But in terms of the volatility, if this is touted as a finite, currency with a finite amount of fixed amount of bitcoins or satoshis, and we don't live in a finite world, we don't live on we live on a finite planet, I suppose. We don't live in a finite universe, as far as we know, in terms of our exposure to it. The population is growing. Even if the population starts to decline, people's desire for stuff is only going to ever increase. thus you're drawing from a pool of a receding pool of Satoshis because people are going to keep losing them. So the volatility is always going to seem to be there in a sense that it's never going to be as reliable. I mean, gold, yes, the price of it has increased, and a lot of these criticisms could be levied against gold too, that it's increased like what, 500, 600% in the last, I don't know, 20 years
20
or so,
years. Mm-hmm.
as a reflection of USD anyways. And maybe Bitcoin's volatility range, do you predict that it's going to start to approximate gold in that respect as moving forward?
Yeah, in the long run, yes, in the long enough time scale. Because if you look at the original Bitcoin cycles, right, you see this volatile like 2 or 3 year up cycle and then a crash. And so the first few cycles it went down 95% and then 91% and then 83%. And so we're seeing like the contraction in the overall price level is getting less and less and less over time. But if you extrapolate that out, right, we're still at like an 83% contraction in the most recent bear market. That means it'll take, 10 of these cycles, another 40 years for Bitcoin to truly be as stable as something like, the bond market or gold or something like this. And the gold also has the advantage of being a much larger asset, right? Gold has a 16, 17 trillion dollar market cap at current, 3,500, 34,
It's more like
$3,400
20
ounce
now,
prices.
but yeah.
Or 20. Okay.
Yeah.
So it's $20 trillion market cap. Bitcoin's at 2. So it's 1/10 of the size. And so that means when you have a smaller market cap, it's much easier to move the price marginally just because there's less liquidity because it's a smaller market. And so gold still retain. And by the way, like I said, I own gold. I have physical gold, American Eagles. I own some silver too. I'm not saying that you have to be 100% into Bitcoin, a cypherpunk and destroy, go throw away all your gold. I'm not saying that. I just view this asset as another hedge and the fact that it has unique properties make it stand apart from gold and silver. But I still own those two assets. But Bitcoin will take a long time, to compress the volatility and to make it stable enough for people to want to view it as a monetary medium to spend it. Because the problem is, this is paradoxical, right? When Bitcoin is going up in price and when it's being volatile and people making money from trading it, it actually prevents it from being used as money because, this is Gresham's law. Gresham said, he's an economist, British economist from the 1700s. He said, well, in a bimetallic system where there's gold and silver, whenever silver is undervalued, people don't want to spend it. They hoard it because it's going to go up in value. And whenever silver is overvalued relative to gold, people want to go out and spend it because it's overvalued. Well, the same thing is true in our fiat system. Fiat is burning at 2% a year, 4% a year, right? Whatever the real inflation rate is. Would you rather spend Bitcoin, which just in the last year went from 60,000 to 110, or would you rather spend something that's deflating at 4% a year? Well, I'd rather spend the currency that's burning away than spend something that's going up. Same with my gold. I don't want to spend my gold. It's going to go up. I'll spend the fiat. And so that means that there's I guess you could say like systemic force that stops gold and Bitcoin from being used as money because just naturally the participants of the market, you and me, don't want to spend it. Logically. And so like that's the hurdle we have to overcome. And I've always said like let's say we want to have a systemic reset between gold and silver or gold and fiat or Bitcoin and fiat. Not only do you need gold going up nominally, you also need and like the gold, like let's say the gold exchange system and the amount of banks that accept it, the amount of merchants that accept it. Same with Bitcoin. You need that going up nominally. You also need the current system melting down. So you need to see worse and worse inflation, more and more debt, more and more economic crises, so that not only do people have a carrot to chase for the gains of gold and Bitcoin, but they also have a stick that hits them and says, hey, you invested in a bunch of bonds. You've been stuck in bonds. Now they've lost 70% of their value and they're going to lose another 70% in 3 years. You're going to be ground down to zero if you don't switch to gold or Bitcoin or do something. And that will be the force that will finally push people into adopting these things as store of value and eventually as assets.
Does it seem reasonable, though, that somebody get rich on a monetary medium? Like, does it seem reasonable that a person who maybe bought, I don't know, 10 Bitcoin back in 2008 when it was a penny is now a millionaire? And where did that money come from? Like, it came from other people who, I don't know. I just have a problem, I suppose, with the fact that nothing is being really created here. Now, I know Bitcoiners will say, well, the network itself is the creation, the proof of work is the creation. But it seems like, let's say I invest in Apple. Apple is producing phones. They're producing something that is tangible and usable and improves people's lives. Whereas Bitcoin, okay, you could make the argument that it's used as a means of transacting and evading, having to
Government
use
authorities.
right, and fiat currencies, and if I want to jump ship and go to one country to the next and not want to have to move a bunch of money, I could just buy Bitcoin and do it that way. But is there an additional value that you would place on this, and how do you rationalize, a person getting rich solely on the basis of other people? Because it's a zero-sum game in the sense that, unlike me investing in an Apple where wealth is actually generated on the basis of manufacturing goods and innovating new products, you're just getting rich by other people buying into the scheme. Not you
Yeah,
personally, but just in general.
sure. So I'll answer your first question, right? Which is, you see, like, what is Bitcoin actually producing, right? What is this network? What does it mean for, for all these miners to be expending hundreds of millions of dollars to build out rigs, to pay for energy? And what they are creating is, you're right, it's not a physical object. It's an intangible, abstract, decentralized computer system that allows for like a monetary medium to be exchanged in a secure, decentralized way. And what that means is that this network is essentially a potential, like I said, a potential future money. And so the reason why it's important is the same reason why investing in internet security is important. Like, you wouldn't claim to, want to have a non-encrypted website or a non-encrypted email server, because then you could be hacked. Then all your information could be leaked. That's an abstract concept. IP, personal information, that's an abstract concept. And yet we place great value on these things. We'll pay cybersecurity firms, millions of dollars a year, especially for large companies, to secure individuals or secure corporations. Bitcoin is that for money. Bitcoin is a secured form of I would say digital gold that allows somebody to invest, hold, and store their wealth in a way that it cannot be taken from them without, like, literal jackboots breaking down your door and gun to your head, tell me your Bitcoin seed phrase. That's like the only way to stop it, right?
Doesn't that happen?
So there's obviously there's people who have been abducted. Yeah, there's people who have been abducted and been forced to shell out their Bitcoin. But when we talk about, like, especially like a government crackdown, the difference between Bitcoin and, like, let's say fiat is if they're going after fiat, right? It's very easy actually for them to stop everyone from transacting. They stop the major card issuing companies. They go freeze all the major banks, and boom, overnight, only 12 to 15 entities they have to go after, and then boom, everything is frozen, right? That's actually what happened in Cyprus. If you look at the 2013 banking crisis there, they froze all the bank transactions and they made everyone own equity in the bank. And so everyone's cash got converted to forced, basically like illiquid equity in a bank. And that is a terrifying, I guess you could say, harbinger of what they could do in a domestic financial crisis. They could just turn all your bank deposits into equity and freeze it. And so Bitcoin is it's another system that exists outside of the traditional fiat system that allows you to survive, even if they do that, financial apocalyptic freeze all the money, nobody gets to transact anything. Or a social credit system where, hey, Canadian Prepper, you talked about some bad things about the government this week. We don't like that you said that. We're going to freeze your bank accounts. We're going to freeze your YouTube earnings. So Bitcoin allows censorship resistant, decentralized, peer-to-peer way to transact without using the traditional system. And then for your second question,
But what if,
but
okay, just sorry to interrupt you, but what if everything comes down to someday being determined by Amazon, and Amazon is the only company that I can buy stuff from, and they say, well, you can't use your Bitcoin here. How does that work?
you mean, so you're saying if there's a monopoly, like a corporate monopoly,
Well,
and
which there
they
already
say,
kind of is, like, I mean, there already is a handful of corporations already kind of control stuff. And if I want to buy stuff, I have to buy it either with debit or Visa or MasterCard. I can't, in a lot of cases, use Bitcoin. Couldn't the government just say, well, you can't buy, you can't use your Bitcoin to buy stuff, which is what they did in China, I guess, in a way.
yeah, you're right. They did ban Bitcoin, they especially went after the miners, but they banned most transactions and made it very difficult. So that is a good point. I've also said that the shutting down the on ramps is another way they could try to attack Bitcoin. But again, my refrain to that is if you okay, so let's say they shut down the ability for you to buy goods with Bitcoin with Bitcoin. Well, I could still buy it with fiat and then I can sell it to you for Bitcoin. And so on net, I would be basically trading my fiat for Bitcoin and you would be sending your Bitcoin to me directly and you would be receiving goods
So don't
for
you still need
Bitcoin.
fiat then in that model? Like, don't they make it so that fiat is necessary? Like if they're saying that, Amazon is only going to be permitted to accept fiat currency, then don't you always need fiat anyways? And I know this is not the fault of Bitcoin. This is the fault of like the monopolization of our, the general nature of the Pareto effect of capitalism. But so it's not really Bitcoin's fault. But what I'm saying is if they can just always make it so that you have to use their currency, and sure, you could have this Bitcoin existing at the same time concurrent with that, but then, you would always need to go to transfer it back into some kind of
Into
currency to
fiat.
use.
Well, so that's a good point, right? Like that's definitely a sticking part where they could try to enforce, right, dollar hegemony, USD hegemony on the people by making it very difficult to transact in Bitcoin. Like I said, peer-to-peer transactions would still be impossible for them to block. So I could have a Bitcoin on a wallet. I could walk to you. I can physically show you, here's my address. You put it in on your computer, you can send me Bitcoin.
Right.
But the benefit of Bitcoin really, and I guess you could say maybe this is like the eventual also end game for the fiat system, is that the current fiat system as it exists is unsustainable, right? Because the problem is the debt is linked to the money. They loan new money into existence via debt creation, via either the treasury borrowing money or by commercial banks loaning money into existence. And so that means that in the long run, the money supply expands at a compounding interest rate and the debt supply expands at a compounding interest rate, which is, by the way, exponential. So an exponentially increasing system is unsustainable by definition. And so the money supply is going to continue to increase exponentially. The debt supply is going to go up exponentially. And that means inflation is going to get worse and worse and worse until people refuse to use it as money. And when you come into the question of like, can the government have infinite enforceability power? Well, the government has enforceability power as long as you have a stable society. So again, grid down scenario. Can the government really enforce laws? Not really. If there's a 400% annual inflation rate, do you think the government and the police will be able to actively enforce all the laws as well as they can at 2%? Absolutely not. And so even if Amazon and even if like these large centralized entities can be coerced in a mostly stable macro environment to do things, that's true, they can be. In a much more unstable macro environment, they won't be able to. And so you'll see companies either breaking away and saying, you know what, screw the government, we're going to accept Bitcoin. They don't have enough officers to even arrest us. Or B, like I said, you'll find decentralized alternatives. So there are already Bitcoin marketplaces. There are already like sites like eBay or, Craigslist where you can go and you can arrange with somebody, text them, hey, I'm going to come over to your house. I want to buy your, fender for the 2006 Honda Civic, and I'll pay you in Bitcoin instead, and I'll show you how to set up a Bitcoin wallet. And in that way, you can transact completely off grid.
And in fairness, in fairness to what I'm saying applies to gold as well. I can't go to Amazon
Mhm.
and buy stuff with gold. So I just want to concede that, this
Mhm.
is a criticism that pertains to gold and silver as well.
Absolutely. And again, what I would say is, okay, you're right. There is no completely perfect system, but Bitcoin is the best shot we have at a sound money system, um, you know, as compared to gold or even silver, right? The issue with gold and silver is the fact that these monetary mediums are not really useful for, you could say, like microtransactions. And 95% of transactions, by the way, happen below $1,000, which just makes sense. You go out, you get coffee, pay for your gas, whatever it is, 90% of your transactions are just going and doing day-to-day things that are relatively cheap. If you're using gold, you're going to have to flake off little pieces of gold. You're going to have to carry around tiny little specks of gold dust because gold is so valuable in order to pay for your goods. That doesn't seem very, sustainable to me. And it also seems kind of antithetical to the digitized, you could say like modern internet-based society that we're leading into. Silver is better because silver is obviously a lot cheaper, but silver has a much higher inflation rate, right? Gold's inflation rate is like 2% a year, and silver's can be as high as like 10% a year. Like they can find there's been times in history where they found deposits of silver that inflate the total supply by 20 or 30% within single years, like the Potosi mine in Peru. And so when we move to a monetary medium, especially in a post-dollar world, and there's the debate between using gold and silver as an actual day-to-day transactional money or Bitcoin, I think the answer will clearly be Bitcoin, just because gold and silver will just be better stores of value than it will be for actual like microtransactions paying for your gas or paying for your coffees.
There is this cosmic question that I always have with Bitcoin. Okay, it's a finite monetary medium with fixed amount of Satoshis. But as I said before, the universe is, as far as we know, it's infinite. So what happens when we
Mhm.
start mining other planets? Maybe we find a planet that has this massive gold supply, and maybe that causes the price of gold to crash. But I would suspect that if we're constantly expanding our horizons, and if the nature of human growth is expansionist, then shouldn't the currency kind of reflect that to a certain extent? In that, okay, imagine the world 1,000 years from now, and the population is 100 billion people who are still transacting in this fixed amount of satoshis as they go and they venture out into this into the universe. Like, is it that future proof really? Or is this just maybe the first iteration? And would Bitcoin enthusiasts be willing to concede that maybe there's going to be a better form of Bitcoin introduced in the future, which is going to render this current network obsolete?
So I'll answer your first question, and then in second question in order. So the first question, right? I would say the fundamental characteristic of any economy that's developing technologically is deflation. So if you look at the 1800s, you see home prices go from $150,000 in today's dollars to about $70,000 by 1900. You
Mm-hmm.
see educational prices go down. You see the price of books go down. You see the price of basically all goods
Gold
and
went
all
down.
forms. Yeah, true. All forms of wealth basically increased just because the real purchasing power of wages was compounding, especially from about 1870 to 1895, 7% a year, which means the middle class was finally able to develop in the US and across the world because productivity and wages were rising so rapidly, and that real wealth was being transferred to everyday people who were just working in the factories or working on a farm and able to earn more and more for their money. And that only happens under a sound money system. In a unsound money system, which is the fiat system we have now, the money supply inflates as much or even more than the population growth, which means prices go up forever. And when you have the prices go up forever, it changes all the incentive mechanisms in the economy. Now it's no longer good to save. It's actually no longer even really good to invest unless it's high risk, high reward investments. It's best to borrow as much as you can, get in debt as much as you can, and speculate as much as you can because the inflation will wipe out the debt in a long enough time frame. And that leads to an economy that's completely unbalanced in terms of its productivity, in terms of its consumption, in terms of its people, right? Real wages since the 1970s have been falling because inflation has outpaced wage growth. And what that means is that the actual living standards of people have been going down. It's been more expensive to afford a home, more expensive to afford college, and none of that is sustainable in the long run for any economy. You cannot price out the entire middle class from a good life and expect the system to survive. It's just not possible. A sound money system allows you to do that. And so Jeff Booth says this eloquently, and he's a major Bitcoiner. He says, when you have scarcity in money, you have abundance in everything else. When you have abundance in money, you have scarcity in everything else. And so when you move towards a system that's deflationary, what it means is that, if the supply is fixed, the price of everything goes down forever. And that's true. Like, most people will see in gold terms, gold prices, the price of everything going down, but that only means there's more incentive to save and actually invest in real capital and real projects, real productivity projects versus speculating and borrowing like our current system incentivizes. And so when you're asking me if, which one is more sustainable for 300 years, I would say it's the Bitcoin standard unequivocally. And you also think about it in this way. People say that the gold, right? Okay, let's use the gold argument. You can't use gold right now as a global monetary asset, global reserve asset, just because there's not enough gold in the world to handle all the transactions. And that's true. But the better way to think about it is there's not enough gold at these prices. At $3,400 an ounce, gold is too cheap. There's too few dollars would buy too much gold in order for global trade to be transacted. At $20,000 an ounce, now we're talking at a level where gold is expensive enough where there's enough of it for everyone to transact, and rather than just a few people hovering up the entire market. And so when we think about the monetary system and the future of the economy, we want to be thinking about one where the money itself, just like a measuring tape or a ruler for a home, the money stays constant, and it's the technology and the economy and the markets that change, not the actual supply and the demand characteristics of the money itself.
Okay. Yeah, I suppose if Bitcoin was not being lost, and again, I guess it would go back to that question of, did everybody had a fair kick at the can in terms of adopting this technology, which I think we're well past that point of everybody having equal access, because there is, one of the criticisms of Bitcoin is that there is a barrier to entry in terms of you got to kind of know how, keys and wallets work and the fees and all the various protocols and things of that nature. So this is why a lot of people will just use something like Coinbase or these places, that these exchanges where you're not really buying the crypto. Is that how it works? If you go on Coinbase and buy Bitcoin, are you actually buying the Bitcoin, or how does that work?
You do actually buy the Bitcoin, and you quote unquote own it, but they hold it for you in what's called a custodial wallet. So it's kind of like a bank account. They say, we have your Bitcoin, and you kind of have to trust them. And many exchanges have been caught lying, right? Which is why I've also said, again, this is the Bitcoin ethos. Do not trust. Like, the entire point is take your money out of the centralized system, take it out of the centralized exchange, take it out of the centralized brokers, and move it to your own address, your own cold wallet storage, where you can show, hey, I have the Bitcoin in this thumb drive. And I even have one here. You have it in a segregated thumb drive. Nobody can touch it. It's air gapped. It's going to take them. This is a Blockstream Jade wallet, and can only be connected with a USB. And when it's air gapped like it is now, no one in the world can take it from me. Only someone physically here with a gun to my head would be able to take it from me. So that makes it, like I said, a much more secure and I guess I would say long-term, defensible system than anything else. And you're I guess concerned that it's not egalitarian is fair, but my refrain would be, what other way could they have launched this? Because the quintessential problem of any new monetary medium is you have to convince people to use it. Same with gold. You'd have to convince people to use gold. So if we go to a grid down scenario tomorrow, and you own a ton of gold, and I don't own a ton of gold, and gold is a new monetary medium, then you would be very rich and I would be very poor. And that is more of a relation of my beliefs towards gold and your beliefs towards gold rather than any sort of intrinsic problem with the system. The issue is in the current fiat system, too many people still believe in the structure and stability and the, I guess you could call, permanence of the system and its ability to sustain itself when it's unsustainable. And so we're trying to convince people, hey, the current fiat financial system is unsustainable. The debt is going up exponentially. The money supply is going up exponentially forever because this is how the system is designed. And every 80 years, there's these debt super cycles where we see a huge washout, right? The 1940s was World War II. We saw the Great Depression, massive, massive monetary chaos. We're going to see the same thing again eventually. And that means that if you don't own a hedge, if you don't own something to defend yourself against the inflation, you're going to be destroyed in real terms. And so that's why you need to own gold, and that's why you need to own Bitcoin.
One of the most compelling arguments for Bitcoin, all the rhetoric that I hear from Michael Saylor and all the arguments, I've never been sold on it, but one of the most compelling arguments for me was a very simple, one-line explanation that Bitcoin is for flight and gold is for war. And I think it was Clem Chambers who I was interviewing who had talked about that. And so I think you make some compelling cases for having some exposure to Bitcoin at this point in time. I would say that, anything short of a full-blown Mad Max nuclear apocalypse, there's probably a use case there, especially if you're wanting to move money from between countries or exchanging in the cyberpunk dystopia for various things and commodities as a way to evade, the centralized monetary systems. Is there any other arguments you would have if you were trying to convince somebody who is a prepper, who is skeptical of maybe not even just Bitcoin, but crypto in general? Any other arguments you would throw at them to say, hey, this is something that you should consider?
Sure. I would say two. So one is, you earlier touched on the tiny size of Bitcoin, 1.3% of the world population owning it, a large part of it already being mined and already being owned. And I would say you could see that as a negative thing, but you could also see that as opportunity. If only 1.3% of the world population owns Bitcoin and only, I think 10% of Americans, because America is a wealthier country, owns it, then that means that there's a lot of people who don't own it yet. And there's a lot of wealth that's yet to transition into Bitcoin. And Bitcoin is only a $2 trillion asset when the global debt market is a $400 trillion market. So if we're 1/200th of the total size of the debt market, and that doesn't even include derivatives or stocks or anything else or real estate, then that means that we have a long way to go. And so you could see this as very risky, but I would say it is very risky, but there's also a huge amount of upside, right? And that upside will come in the coming years as the price starts to appreciate more and more, and we see more and more adoption, more and more corporations, and maybe even nation states starting to buy Bitcoin as like a form of a new global reserve currency. The second thing I would use to argue for Bitcoin is its decentralized nature, its censorship resistance, its, you could say, anti-fragile-like effects that we talked about earlier, its ability to fight against a centralized system, make it actually great for a post-collapse scenario, right? When the dust settles and there's an EMP, a massive disaster, there's a war, and you're living in that, post grid down scenario, and you are trying to transact monetarily, or let's say new local governments start to pop up, they're not going to be able to really issue money in the same way that a federal government will be able to. And so both gold and Bitcoin, I think, will play roles in that post collapse scenario in rebuilding society, because the entire point of prepping is not to prep and live in, you don't want to live in that kind of like caveman-esque hunting for your food forever. You would hope that, yes, there's a transition period, maybe 1 year, maybe 3 years, but eventually society would start to restabilize. We'd be able to rebuild and revive the economy and the markets and the industry so that we could go back to where we were, right? We wouldn't want to live in there forever. And if that scenario does start to play out, if we have a disaster and we have to rebuild, we'll need an economic system, and for an economic system, we need a money supply. And I think Bitcoin is the best solution in that case.
Just two more questions for you.
Sure.
Do you need the internet for Bitcoin? Is it like if there was a, grid down disconnect, is it possible to transact in a way, maybe utilizing like mesh networking or some other way that the system could still function in the absence of the actual internet?
Yeah, so actually, the Bitcoin nodes can transact and transmit transactions via a radio mesh network. So you could transfigure radios so that, especially AM radios, so that they could transmit information with binary code, and then everyone could tune to that frequency, and they could actually still be able to control the ledger and to understand, like, when transactions are being held, when your transaction goes through, and you could actually see it in real time. As long as you need to have electricity, and you would need to have access to a radio system. And so the only scenario in which that wouldn't happen would be something like a global EMP or a very severe solar flare that wipes out everything. But my contention with people is, if there's a global solar flare or if there's a nuclear war, my concerns are going to be bigger than my Bitcoin holdings. I'm going to be worried about surviving the next 48 hours or the next 72 hours rather than the money supply I have. And the gold that you have in the vault also will be pretty useless if everyone is dead and all electronics are fried. And so in those worst scenarios, that's why food and bullets and medical supplies are so important. You need those tangible goods to be prepared for any sort of catastrophe like that. So in those scenarios, I'd say, it's essentially impossible to kill. In the worst case scenario, it can die, but you'll have bigger problems to worry about.
That's very cool. Very, very cool. Okay, so you're called the Peruvian bull, but you got a lot of bearish sentiments as well towards the market in general. So what is your prognosis macroeconomically, just for the current state of things? I'm looking at your channel and there's a lot of bearish news, it would appear. So where do you see this whole thing going? Are we going to see a financial crash?
So the way the current system has been constructed is that the monetary authorities have switched from using overt easing mechanisms to what I would call like covert monetary easing mechanisms. So, you can call this like stealth QE. So in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis, they enacted, basically like QE1, then QE2, then Operation Twist. They did the TARP program from the Treasury to buy back a bunch of toxic bonds. They'd made Maiden Lane 1 and 2 to buy off a bunch of toxic assets, MBS and CDS from the banks and the brokers and the insurance companies that all held all this stuff. But ever since 2020, they faced the same situation, but they didn't want to come out and lose face by saying, hey, we're going to have to do bailouts and we're going to have to find ways of adding liquidity to the system to make sure everything keeps running, right? To keep the gears greased on this economic engine. So what they started doing is they started creating covert methods of monetary easing. The first one actually happened on March 16th, 2020, when they lowered the reserve requirement ratio for all banks to 0%, meaning banks don't have to hold any reserves against your deposits. They can print the money, give you the deposit, and not have to hold any capital against it in case you don't pay back your loan and your deposit is lost. Then they did what's called reverse repo and TGA. So reverse repo is essentially a way for institutions to park cash at the Fed. And the Fed incentivized all these money market funds, brokers, banks to park their cash at the Fed. And this window grew to $2.2 trillion at the height, which meant that basically a lot of cash was stored in the Fed's balance sheet, and that allowed them to hold onto that cash for a rainy day. And once they started the taper in 2023, the balance of reverse repo started to fall. So they were easing all into 2021, 2022. They were printing $120 billion a month, $90 billion a month going to treasuries, the rest going to MBS. And when that liquidity wave was over, the market started to contract, and we started to see, things like the Silicon Valley banking crisis start to erupt. And so what they did is they moved to, okay, where can we find more liquidity without actually printing money? Well, we store all this excess liquidity in this reverse repo window, and same with the TGA, which is the government's essentially checking account. We'll just draw those down, and that will offset the losses from the banking sector and all the other problems emerging. And so there's much more about this on my Substack, and I can send you the link to that if people want to read it. But they did all these kind of like monetary, you could call it like sleight of hand, where they use parts of the banking system to inject more money and inject liquidity without actually showing it on their balance sheet. And so that I expect that to play out. The ultimate end goal, or I guess you could say like end state of the system, is more and more liquidity, more and more money printing, and more debt, just because that's how compound interest works. You can't, like the Bitcoiners say, you can't taper your way out of a Ponzi. And the current fiat system is in many ways a Ponzi because it requires more and more debt and more money to be shoveled into it for it to sustain itself.
Well, I got to say, man, I've listened to a lot of arguments for Bitcoin, and this by far has been the most informative talk or just podcast that I've personally have heard. I'm not just saying that because it's on the Canadian Prepper channel, but somebody who I hold in high esteem, Robert Breedlove, for instance, was not able to convince me in the ways that you're convincing me today. So I'm going to try to see if we can set up. Would you be willing to have a debate with Peter Schiff on my channel?
Absolutely. Sure. I would love that.
I think that would be excellent, because I think we can hopefully sort out once and for all, whether or not this is something that we as preppers should be, giving a second look. Honestly, you've convinced me to give it a second look. So,
okay.
Well done. Well done.
Thank you. Yeah. Like I said, a few percent. Not saying you have to go become a full board.
I'm not saying I'm going to go and load up on it. I want to make that clear. Yeah. I'm just saying I'm going to give it a second look.
That's good. Awesome.
All right, guys. And I want you to give the Peruvian Bull YouTube channel a second look as well. Thanks a lot for coming on, Roberto. Appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me.
The best way to support this channel is to support yourself by gearing up at CanadianPreparedness.com, where you'll find high-quality survival gear at the best prices, no junk, and no gimmicks. Use discount code PREPPINGGEAR for 10% off. Don't forget, the strong survive, but the prepared thrive. Stay safe.